Hi, and welcome back to the Vital Podcast, a health and wellness podcast for people who are tired of health and wellness podcasts. I'm Val, your host, and I cover topics in wellness, things that aren't so well in wellness, and everything in between. So, this is actually the very first official season of Vital. I had done a very unofficial season prior to this, and reception was so overwhelmingly positive and so very kind. So, thank you for that. But I have decided to come back and give the people what they really want, which is more reasons to dunk on the FDA. So I spent many years reversing my PCOS, my thyroid autoimmunity, my endometriosis and mold illness, and just so much more. I was really not well for a while, but I'm here now, and I am attempting to impart some morsel of knowledge unto you about how you can avoid the pit of despair known as the hospital waiting room. So I hope you stay and enjoy. And above all, I hope you learn something. So this season, I really wanted to focus on building an educational foundation around additives and how their safety is evaluated, or rather not evaluated, and also to really drive home the importance of reading labels, avoiding certain ingredients, and just generally not taking the industry and government information at face value. So, with that, if you remember my episode on citric acid, I very briefly mentioned something called GRAS, or generally recognized as safe, which is this categorization that the FDA has that is given to additives that is supposed to give consumers this warm and fuzzy feeling of confidence that the products that they're consuming are safe. Unfortunately for us, the absolute bellends at the esteemed FDA have, instead of confidence, given us the gift of the middle finger. And it all started in 1958, my mom's birth year. Happy early birthday, Mom. So, the US government introduced a new law that would require companies to show that the ingredients that they were using were safe. However, there was a small loophole for time tested ingredients like baking soda and vinegar and salt, just like things that we knew for sure are safe to consume. And GRAS is actually a part of a broader law that Congress passed in 1936, known as the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And it was a response to concerns that consumers had about the safety of products. And it is still in effect to this very day, but there have been various amendments made to it, GRAS being one of them. So, through the 1970s, as companies developed a bunch of ingredients, the protocol was that they would write into the FDA and they would seek FDA approval for their ingredients on whether or not it was safe to consume. And the FDA would either say it's GRAS or it's not. And in 1972, there were so many requests that the FDA actually created a very formalized special committee that would review these ingredients and essentially rule on their safety. However, the additive industry going into the 80s and 90s was growing stupid fast because packaged foods was really getting out of control and we were all addicted to Little Debbie. And the FDA was just absolutely swamped with review requests. And, they got a little sloppy. And a lot of the reviews ended up being fast tracked just because they didn't have the resources to go super in depth on each and every one of these. So then in 1997, the FDA introduced a little something known as the voluntary GRAS notification system, where they were like, you know what? Screw this. We actually don't want to do our one job anymore. And they handed control over to the food and beverage industries. And they said, you know what? You can submit the safety data if you want, or don't. We don't care anymore. So, between a general push towards deregulation in all industries across the board and really heavy lobbying from the food and beverage industry, and just a major lack of funding for the FDA, led to this catastrophic oversight. And look, I'm not one for big government intervention. However, companies were now allowed to decide for themselves whether or not an ingredient was safe, but also if they even wanted to inform the FDA that they were using it. And if they did inform the FDA, then they could just say, hey, this is generally recognized as safe, and the FDA would just blindly accept that. So the safety of the ingredients that were going to consumers was being determined by the honor system, by companies whose main goal is to increase shareholder value. But this was obviously very controversial, and it continues to be very controversial to this very day, but unfortunately, there's just not a whole lot that can be done about it. So now, even if a company does studies, they typically either do them in-house or they do them by a private panel of experts that usually has ties to the industry. And there was actually this really interesting study in 2013 that found pretty much all GRAS panels had ties to the food industry. And so just a little bit of statistics here. it was 22% of GRAS determinations were made by experts that were employed by the ingredients manufacturer, and about 13 were made by people hired by a consulting firm that were working with the food industry directly. And these are just direct ties. There was another like 60 or 65% that had indirect ties. So, like experts who had worked for other food companies or had positions in organizations that were funded by the industry. So typically, when you see companies really touting experts, I would just be super wary of that because a lot of times they are hired by the company to get the seal of approval for their product, and there is usually a very heavy affiliation there. Okay, so now I actually want to go over a couple of ingredients that were given GRAS status due to sheer FDA incompetence, mostly to illustrate that the government seals of approval do not hold the weight that they should, and hopefully to encourage you to be a little bit more diligent in reading food labels and deciding for yourself what is safe and what isn't safe. And again, just not to trust the FDA blindly. Okay, so first on the list, and the only ingredient that the United States has since banned, like kind of, but we'll get to that, is partially hydrogenated oils, also known as trans fats. So they were used a bunch in processed foods and godforsaken abominations like margarine to improve the texture and the flavor and also the shelf life, because unnatural forces of Satan like that simply do not die. And if you've been alive and not living under a rock, then you might remember some of the controversy regarding trans fats that happened back in the day. There was a huge public outcry because a bunch of evidence came out that it increased risk of stroke, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and basically just all of the really bad metabolic diseases. They were shown to raise the bad cholesterol and lower the good cholesterol. And eventually, after enough pressure, the FDA finally rescinded the GRAS status of trans fats. So in 2015, they started to be phased out of foods. However, there is a loophole, like there always is. And it's that foods that have trans fats that are imported from countries where trans fats are still permitted are allowed to be sold in the United States. And companies actually still are allowed to petition the FDA to keep using trans fats, even for things that are manufactured in the United States, if there are certain technical requirements. So, achieving a certain texture, or maybe for shelf life, if there's no other way to achieve that. And the FDA reviews these on a case by case basis. And I will give them some credit. They usually do have stipulations around when it does need to be phased out eventually. So, the company is under pressure to get it out. However, this is a certified FDA hate podcast. And so I do have to say that the FDA was aware for decades that trans fats were horribly bad for us and still chose to do nothing until 2015. So, of course, I would personally avoid this and look for products that use olive oil or avocado oil or natural animal fats like butter or ghee or tallow. All right, so next up on our list is BHA, also known as butylated hydroxyanisole, and it's used to prevent the oils and fats in food from going rancid, mostly in packaged foods, of course. So it's been shown to cause cancer in animals, and it's also an endocrine disruptor, which is just something that disrupts our hormone health by disrupting the balance of hormones in the body. But even more notably, BHA causes something called oxidative stress. And if you haven't listened to my oxidative stress episode yet, I would highly encourage you to go do so because I go into excruciating detail on how it works and what it does to the body. But long story short, which is like an unheard of sentence on this podcast, what it does is it generates free radicals in the body, which cause cell damage and also induces an inflammatory response. And these free radicals basically become unmitigated when there is not enough antioxidants to balance them in the body. And all of this can damage the DNA, the proteins, the lipid in our cells, and just generally wreak all sorts of havoc on a cellular level. So, to the shock and surprise of literally nobody, while BHA is banned in other countries due to safety concerns, it is still fully legal to use in the United States. So, the most surefire way to avoid this is to, of course, avoid packaged and processed foods. I will say that there are brands that are phasing this out, and one alternative that I see used pretty frequently is rosemary extract. So, if you see this on a label, more likely than not, a brand has moved away from using BHA and is instead using more natural alternatives. All right, so this next one is so insane. I had no choice but to dedicate an entire episode to it, and it's actually coming out right after this one, so keep an eye out. Okay, so titanium dioxide is used as a whitening agent in foods and supplements and a lot of cosmetics still, actually. So when it's consumed and used topically, it can cause oxidative damage, like we just talked about. So again, DNA damage, and it absolutely ruins the digestive system. It's typically used in its nanoparticle form, which means that it can penetrate the gut lining even more effectively. Love that for us. And from there, it can mess up the microbiome and cause conditions like leaky gut, which is just an unmitigated disaster, incredibly difficult to fix, very annoying to fix. Maybe it's not very difficult to fix, but it's very annoying to fix. I would know. I have done it. I would not recommend it. So leaky gut is basically when proteins and other things and bacteria can penetrate and get into the bloodstream and cause all sorts of issues. So, this is truly a menace of an ingredient. I cannot overstate how much I hate it and also how far you should go to avoid it like the plague. This one is definitely shown on labels, and if you go to the makeup aisle or the supplement aisle, or look at your tampons, you are going to have a very easy time spotting this. There are a lot of popular supplement brands, especially ones that are used in like a powder form, and a lot of really popular tampon brands that use this. I'm not going to name any names despite really, really wanting to, but I would encourage you to just go to the store and take a peep at the labels, and you're going to have a very easy time finding it and hopefully avoiding it. So, once again, it's banned in other countries. The EU is particularly concerned about its safety. Unlike in the US, where it is still allowed to be used, it is generally recognized as safe and it is used with reckless abandon, which is just mind boggling. So, another super fun one that I do have another whole podcast coming out on is artificial food dyes. So, like red 40, yellow number 5, blue 1. These are obviously used to color food to make it more appealing to younger audiences and adults who perhaps have not fully developed their frontal cortex. I'm going to keep the health effects on this rather short because, like I said, I have an entire episode dedicated to the seventh layer of hell creation that this is, and I'm going to cover all of that there in great detail. But in essence, food dyes can lead to ADHD. They can worsen ADHD and lead to ADHD. They can increase tumor growth, they can increase allergies, and they can cause hormone disruption and just a whole lot more. They do act differently. So some of them will mimic hormones, which is what leads to hormone disruption. And some of them can actually affect our neurotransmitters, like in the case of ADHD. So, you know the drill by now. Yes, artificial food dyes are banned in Europe, but the US still allows it to be used, not just used in our food, but also to be heavily marketed to children who are especially susceptible to the health effects of this. Straight to the state penitentiary, 10-year minimum, no option for parole. I don't make the rules, but perhaps I should. Okay, I like talking about this next one because not a lot of people would consider it toxic because its originating source is seaweed. But carrageenan is a polysaccharide that is sourced from seaweed, and its job is to help thicken and emulsify foods. So, especially in things like milk alternatives. It was given GRAS status in the early 60s, well before there were any studies done to show health effects, long term health effects, any kind of health effects, but it has kept its GRAS status despite mounting evidence against it. There's actually some really interesting regulatory fuckery going on around it between the National Organic Board and the USDA, which is the US Department of Agriculture, when it comes to continuing approval for carrageenan in foods. So the National Organic Board said, hey, we see evidence coming out that it's really bad for gut health, and we would like to ban its use in foods. And the USDA looked around and said, no. So it is still allowed to be in use. Obviously, the USDA did not heed the warning of the National Organic Board, and now we get to pay the price. So, bureaucratic shenanigans aside, carrageenan has been shown to be extremely harmful to the digestive system. So it can damage the gut lining by disrupting the mucosal barrier that we have in our gut, and it can lead to symptoms like bloating and conditions like IBS, which I know every hot girl apparently has, probably because you guys drink a lot of almond milk and oat milk, and it has a lot of carrageenan in it. So long-term exposure can lead to even more serious effects like colon cancer, ulcers, and intestinal lesions. Carrageenan can also trigger an immune response in the gut and cause inflammation. So this inflammatory response isn't just temporary, like when you consume carrageenan, it can build up and it has this cumulative effect over time. And it can actually activate the immune cells in a way that releases chemicals like histamine and other really inflammatory substances, which in turn can make the body mistakenly attack its own tissues, like in the case of autoimmune diseases, even if you don't have an autoimmune disease. It can also directly harm the gut cells and lead to cell damage and even cell death in the gut lining. And the cherry on top is that there have actually been a few studies that show that carrageenan exposure can lead to tumor growth in lab animals. So I'm keeping a close eye on this because obviously in vitro and animal studies are not always very conclusive, but they can be a really good starting point for us to avoid ingredients. So this is really easy to spot on labels, especially in milk alternatives and baked goods and like powdery substances like protein powders and baby formula. It's really not super necessary though. There are other alternatives for thickening agents and emulsifiers that can be used. If you drink a lot of milk though, the brand Malk does not have any additives. They just use like organic oats, Himalayan salt, and filtered water. And I was actually at Whole Foods the other day and I saw another brand that I can't remember the name of now. It was like something farm, but honestly, just go to the store, flip over the labels and make sure there's no, additives in it. Also, I'm not affiliated with Malk. They were just the first ones that I saw that did not have a dictionary on the back of their ingredient label. All right, so next up is one that you probably have heard of before. It has definitely made the rounds in the news cycle before, and that is propylparaben. So you've probably seen products that say paraben free on it, and this is where it comes from. So parabens are used to inhibit mold and bacterial growth in foods and cosmetics and even pharmaceuticals. And like with so many other things in this podcast, parabens are a major endocrine disruptor, which again just means that it disrupts our natural hormone cycle. So in this case, it actually mimics our natural estrogen in the body and it throws the body's natural cycle out of whack. Because estrogen is one of the main female hormones and is responsible for many a thing, mimicking it in the body in this way can be incredibly dangerous. So this can lead to breast cancer, reproductive health issues, disruption of the menstrual cycle, as if we didn't have enough problems with that already. And for men, it can tank your testosterone. How fun. So, all of these effects are incredibly well documented in studies. The FDA is fully aware of the effects that this has on our bodies, and yet it is still considered GRAS. So, on labels, just be aware of anything that ends with a paraben. Another name to look out for is parahydroxybenzoate. And parabens in foods are typically found in baked goods, so everything from breads to pastries. Honestly, just find a local bakery or farmer's market that is going to bake things fresh every day, because that way they're not going to have a need to use a lot of these gross additives. And of course, parabens are found in a lot of personal care products like shampoos and body washes. And this is kind of where you'll see a lot of brands moving away from it because you'll see paraben free on almost every shampoo bottle nowadays, which is a great change. So just be aware when you're looking for makeup and personal care products that you choose something that does not have parabens in it. All right. And I think we've actually made it to the very end of our additives list that I was going to go through. Um, Actually, no, okay, no, there's one more that didn't actually make the cut originally, but I thought of it as I was talking about breads and pastries just now. And I kind of want to get into a little bit because Americans complain a lot about the quality of bread in the States versus other countries. Not just bread, I guess, but carbs in general. Okay, so in the wonderful United States of America, companies are allowed to use something called potassium bromate in baked goods. This stuff helps the dough to rise and it can make the texture a little bit nicer and easier to work with. So instead of treating the dough with the respect that it deserves, we do things that would incite a national revolution with unrestrained guillotine use in France. So potassium bromate is this god-awful ingredient that can lead to thyroid cancer and kidney cancer, and it's actually processed by the kidneys, so it can subsequently damage the kidney cells and promote tumor growth. And actually, same thing with the thyroid. It can affect regular thyroid cell function and lead to mutations. I'm sure you're not surprised by now. It is banned in the EU, in Canada, in the UK, and pretty much every place that believes in the sanctity of baking. There are, of course, many factors involved in our wheat and flour being generally inferior. Like pesticide use, herbicide use, genetic modification to increase yields, which subsequently increases the gluten content a lot of times and also worsens the taste by extension. But since the potassium bromate affects thyroid health, it can actually affect weight gain, and it can cause weight gain more rapidly, which you just don't see with European foods as much. So, one thing I would recommend is obviously avoiding the baked goods section in your typical grocery store, or anything that has been like pre made. But if you do enjoy baking yourself, I would look into something called einkorn flour. Einkorn is a different type of wheat strain with a naturally lower gluten content, and it also hasn't been GMO'd to hell and back. There is a brand based out of Italy called Jovial that is really good. They produce it, and they have flour and like pastas, and they make these amazing sourdough crackers that I would probably go to war for. I'm not affiliated with Jovial, but I do love them a lot. I bake with them all the time. I love their flour. I love all their products, honestly. I wish I was affiliated with them, actually. That would be awesome. But it does take some getting used to, though, because it absorbs water at a slower rate. So you can't just substitute it 1 to 1 for regular flour. But it tastes a lot better. So it's kind of worth the extra effort. Okay, that is my spiel on that. So these are just a few of the most common ingredients that I could think of off the top of my head that have a GRAS status. But there's a whole world out there of absolutely despicable ingredients like aluminum additives that can lead to Alzheimer's risk, sodium nitrite and nitrate, and MSG, which honestly deserves its own episode because it is really, really bad. I think I actually covered some of it in my citric acid episode, which is a good one to listen to if you haven't yet. So naturally, the FDA has come under a lot of criticism for the system. There actually is a bill out right now that could potentially close this loop and make the FDA oversee the chemical additives again. It is currently under consideration in the House of Representatives, but we all know how those bills work, so I'm not holding my breath. Although it would be a really great regulatory change. So, my parting words would really just be just because the FDA considers something GRAS, I would encourage you to think twice about it because more likely than not, some intern at a manufacturer submitted a half assed PDF, called it a day, and the FDA gave it the green light. That is, if they even know about it. Companies might not submit any data at all. So, one thing I do sometimes is I pick an ingredient and I will go look up when it was granted GRAS status and if there were any studies that were submitted along with it. And I'll take a look at the studies themselves and, kind of see was it done by the company? Was it done by the manufacturer? Was it done by some, affiliated third party? And sometimes there weren't any studies at all. So I hope that this has been informative, entertaining, educational, perhaps enraging to some of you. And yeah, if you like the episode, I encourage you to share it with all your friends. And don't forget, fuck the FDA. And until next time.